Welcome to Books of Our Time, brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. Today we shall discuss a book about the vast changes in technology during the 19th century, the century which saw more change than any other, including the 20th. The book is Mr. Gatling's Terrible Marvel. Joining me today is the author, Julia Keller. Ms. Keller is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and cultural critic at the Chicago Tribune. And I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Julia, thank you for coming from Chicago, a lot farther than most of our guests who come from as far away as Boston, sometimes New York or Washington. Julia, I'd like you to comment on something. I have read or heard it said or whatever that in the year 1800, farmers were using the instruments of Roman times. Communication over land moved at the speed of a man or a horse, and it took longer to go by road from the Channel to Rome than it had in Roman times because the roads were better in Roman times. By the year 1900, everything had changed dramatically. Why don't you just list and briefly describe some of those changes in communications, weaponry, industry, et cetera, et cetera.
You know, I think you've just put your finger on what was so intriguing to me about exploring the 19th century for this book, was just looking at the amazing velocity and volume of the changes that came about in this century. We're always lamenting today, oh, the speed of change, this and that. You look at the 19th century and you think, oh my goodness, how did people even begin to wrap their minds around this period of time when, as you say, you went from a person walking or riding a horse to steamboats, to railroads, to, by very early in the 20th century, just right over the lip of the end of the 19th century, aircraft flight. It's just phenomenal to even contemplate. And I think the changes that it brought about in people's mindset too, the changes it brought about culturally, are also significant. One of the points I make in the book is that you can look at a Gatling gun, which in many ways prefigured the mass culture that we know today, as another way of thinking about the world, not just an armament, but another way of looking at the 19th century and those changes. When you went from an individual world, an artisan-made world, a one-of-a-kind world, through the advent of interchangeable parts and industrial capacity to what we think of today as this great mass culture, mass world. I mean, we throw around terms like mass media all the time. But these were revolutionary concepts, just as you suggest. Yeah. The world changed completely.
You know, you talk about focus on the mass rather than the individual. In warfare, it had always been thought that the individual makes a tremendous difference. Back to the days when individual chieftains at the heads of their armies would joust one against the other. Things like the Gatling gun and the repeating rifle, which they also had during the Civil War. And certainly this became exceptionally true by the time of World War I. The individual didn't count anymore.
Yes.
With the machine guns, you know, you pull the trigger, you tap it from now so it sweeps, and you kill thousands of people.
Like stalks in a field.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. And imagine the great change that brought about, where, just as you say, in warfare there'd always been the idea of individual valor. It was me against you, one-on-one. It was our pluck and our valor and our bravery against each other. It was this elemental, fundamental duel. Suddenly, you had the introduction of technology that could kill people in one great sweep of indifference.
Yeah.
Technology to the battlefield changed that calculus, tragically changed it, but irrevocably changed it.
Yeah. And of course, the ultimate in such change were nuclear weapons.
Yes, and I think the Gatling gun culturally prefigured it, not from a technical standpoint, of course, but from a cultural standpoint, it really did. From a mindset standpoint, it got us used to the idea of killing people on a mass scale. Right,
right. We killed wholesale instead of retail, one might say. This had an effect in the Civil War itself, as I understand it, because when the Civil War started, armaments were in the pre-modern stage, for the most part. By 1862 or 3, armaments, at least in terms of invention, were entering the modern stage. Repeating rifles, Gatling guns, rifled cannons, some of which the Armstrong Whitworth of England could shoot 4 and 5 miles. the people who ran the Union Army, and for that matter the Confederate Army too, they didn't want to hear from any of this stuff, did they?
Right, not at all, not at all. They were not at all happy with this. I mean, you know, the old line that generals are always perfectly prepared to fight the last war.
Yeah.
There's a very conservative turn of mind to the military mind, and that's as things should be. That's exactly how you would want it. You wouldn't want your generals to be out there grabbing every new shiny bauble that came along. But at the same time, these innovations in weaponry were coming fast and furious, and they had to be grasped, and the nations that did grasp them were the ones that would end up being the victors. The Germans signed on to the machine gun manufacture long before the British and the French caught on, and it helped them in World War I.
Yeah. Now, I want to return to that in a minute, but I want to go back to something. By the time of the Civil War, and speaking of the change in technology, the North had something like 20 or 30,000 miles of railroad track.
Mm-hmm.
South didn't have anything like that. Well, the steamboat and the railroad played, and macadam, the surface known as macadam. Discuss a little bit what those three things meant in terms of knitting the country together, in terms of the spread of disease, in terms of commerce, what they meant from roughly, steamboats really started going on the Western rivers around 1815 or so.
Yes, yes, very early on. And in the 1830s and 40s, the steamboats really began to take over. They would link together cities that had been isolated before. So you went from a agrarian, rural country, very small, people were isolated, there wasn't a lot of communication economically or just in a communication way of spreading news with each other, to a country that was linked together.
St. Louis and Cincinnati, for example.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
Yeah.
And suddenly we're linked together,
yeah.
and that brings good things and bad things. One of the bad things it brought, as you alluded to, is the spread of smallpox. As long as human beings are isolated in small towns, smallpox can't spread as rapidly. It needs a human host to spread. It's not like anthrax that can lie on the ground for many years and then find a host and then come alive again. It needs a human host. So the steamboats were the good and the bad. And I think that's why I was intrigued.
And they would
as well.
blow up regularly.
They would blow up regularly. They were very dangerous. Yes,
yeah.
This is a point I make a lot. We think of them as very quaint today. The steamboats we have are kind of decked out with men in their fancy hats and women in frilly gowns and all this. But steamboats were terrible. Mark Twain's brother was in a terrible steamboat accident, was scalded and burned to death after an agonizing several hours. He was attended at his bedside by a heartbroken Mark Twain. And Mark Twain's view of the rivers, I think, was perfect. It's a perfect amalgam for how steamboats and how the rivers featured in people's ideas at that time. He loved the river. He was a riverboat man himself, but he also knew how dangerous the steamboats were at this time because the commerce was emerging so quickly that the captains would push them past the capacity of the boilers, so they were dangerous and rickety.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, probably more men were killed on a ship when a steamboat blew up, taking people home from the Civil War, taking them back north. 2,000 or 3,000 Union veterans returning home were killed in that explosion. Now,
I was going to say we also don't have the exact numbers on that because, amazingly enough, they weren't covered the way things are today. If you can imagine a mass death like that today, any more than 2 or 3 people, you'd have CNN and MSNBC and everybody there. It wasn't like that then. The records, there's a great book called Steamboats on the Western Rivers by Louis Hunter, a major historian. And he points out the records are really what they have is pretty skimpy. So we know there was a lot more than that, and what we have is pretty horrific.
Yeah. Now the railroads, which took over from the steamboats, they knit the commerce in the north, east and west, instead of the northwest, meaning in those days Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin. They knit it to the east, whereas otherwise it was they were knit to the south in New Orleans.
Because of the river.
Because of the river.
Mississippi River.
Yeah. And so that made all the difference in the Civil War.
It's also, it's one of the reasons, too, why Chicago soon took over from St. Louis and became the major city in the middle of the 19th century, because St. Louis was very much attached to the rivers, to the Mississippi River and New Orleans, and then you had Chicago, which was linked to the cities of the East, New York, Boston.
Right. And in terms of transportation, whereas a fast ship around 1800 might do 8 or 9 knots. And this was before the days of clipper ships, which were doing 14 and 15 knots. Whereas a fast ship might do 8 or 9 knots, and it would took, what, 2 months to cross the ocean? By 1900, you had ships going from Liverpool or Southampton to New York City in 5 days.
It's just unfathomable to think of the change that would make in your mindset. I remember reading a book about Jefferson once when it talked about Thomas Jefferson lived in an 8-mile-a-day world. You know, that's just what you just couldn't go very far. The roads were bad. I make the point in the book about stagecoaches overturned all the time.
Oh, yes, yes.
It would take you weeks and weeks and weeks to get anywhere. And then suddenly, within people's lifetime, this is not a long period of time. It's the speed of the change, not just the change, but how rapidly it kind of gets its hooks into the culture and soon becomes the norm.
To talk about some others, because this, as I've said at lunch, is a real hobby horse of mine, because so few people know what you have written about, which is fundamentally not just the Gatling gun, but the technological change and the mindset of the 19th century. Starting in the late 1840s, whereas previously overland communications, speed of a man or speed of a horse, or later the railroad, the telegraph, instantaneous.
Yes, yes.
What hath God wrought?
What hath God wrought? Yeah, Samuel Morse is another great example of one of these inventors of the time, and Gatling was in this great motley mix of people that were creating the modern world, one invention at a time.
Yeah, and they were amateurs. That's a point you stress all the time. Morse was an artist.
Yes, yes.
Didn't he make his living basically as an artist?
He did. That was his great dream. This telegraph thing was, just, well, you know, kind of a hobby at night in the garage. No, it's true. The land of the amateur. I mean, that's the, I think that's such an important point about the 19th century. We are an overly credentialed world. I mean, that's good. If you're going to have brain surgery, heaven knows you want to see that MD degree hanging on the wall. But we lose something, too, by a world that's overly credentialed. Because credentials, as we all know, can mean everything or nothing. The proof is in the doing. And we had a world then where you really had to go out and demonstrate and prove who you were. Gatling had no formal education, like most people of the day. He had a few years at a school, at a local school in his area in North Carolina, but no real education, not like today. Today, you wouldn't get in through the door of some of the places where he needed to go sell his invention. They would call security. And it's a shame. We've lost a lot of that kind of gumption and the idea of individual initiative as being all you needed.
So you had the telegraph invented by an amateur.
Yes.
In the 1870s, you got the telephone invented by an amateur. Although, you know, people also don't think very much about the concept of parallel invention. Because, you know, the old story is that Bell beat Elisha Gray to the patent office by a day.
Yes.
Or else we'd be talking about the Gray Telephone Company, not the Bell Telephone Company.
Well, and of course, right, and Edison didn't invent the light bulb. He made a few modifications to an existing, there are very few pure inventions. And the point I make in the book, too, is Gatling was far from the first person to invent a multiple firing weapon. His was just the best, and he marketed it. That's the other great salient fact of the 19th century. The marketing, the salesmanship, the push, the vigor, the keeping after it. And that's often forgotten, too. This was a salesman's world. And that's part of what made us great. I mean, America was the great land of the huckster, and I mean that in the best possible sense of the word. The salesman.
Okay, so you had the telephone, and then you got the phonograph. You got the electric light. How many light bulbs did Edison put was it the St. Louis Exposition?
Yeah, I've got something like 40,000. Yeah, huge number. And this was, he would light up, he realized it's all about the salesmanship. You can invent the light bulb all you want. People, light bulb, but have them suddenly see night turned into day. And then you're talking about a great extravaganza. It was the age of the great demonstration, the great public demonstration. When Gatling invented his gun, he didn't take out an ad in the Army and Navy Journal. He had a public demonstration. Bring the wife and kids, bring a picnic basket, bring the dog, come down and see the streets of Indianapolis. Come and see my new gun. Unthinkable today.
Unthinkable, but we do sort of the same thing on TV today, don't we?
Well, I suppose you could, I suppose you could make that argument that that's our mass culture now. There was certainly a lot more of the great public event, the World's Fairs. I talk about how many just expositions. The Great Columbian Exposition in Chicago was an example of one and it was all filled with new products. Yes, there were rides, and yes, there were hot dogs and ice cream cones that people hadn't seen before. But these great expositions, the Philadelphia Exposition in 1876. begun by President Grant. He pulled the lever and the
Yeah.
great Corliss engine clanked to life.
Yes.
And people were amazed
Huge
and
steam
mesmerized.
engine.
Yes, yes.
Right. And it ran all the belts throughout the
Ran
whole
all
place.
everything all the, through the,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's just this amazing, what I tried to do is to capture that time when there was such excitement in the air for all the right reasons. That human ingenuity, this is what it could do.
Right.
If you had a new idea, you could take it to market and you could end up here at a great fair where you'd have kids running around,
Right.
eyes wide,
Right.
people
Right.
amazed.
And then you got typewriters.
Yes.
By 1835, you had the steam printing press, so this became the most literate nation in the world, bar none.
That's so true. It's all accessibility to type, to printed
Yeah.
material.
Yeah.
What it limited before was, as you know, you had very, very few books around that people could even have access to. Very,
Right.
very few. To own a book or two in your lifetime was
Right.
an amazing thing. And
Right.
suddenly, here you had mass production
Yeah.
of books, these
Yeah.
printed objects.
I have read, Julia, I won't vouch for the truth of it, but I have at least read that the Civil War armies of the North were the most literate and largest letter-writing armies in the history of the world, because literacy had spread so quickly and public education had spread so quickly in the North, and it was before the days of military censorship.
Ah.
See, so by the time World War I and World War II comes around, the censor's looking at everything the guy writes.
Yeah.
But that didn't happen in the Civil War. So that was, our records of the Civil War from the troops themselves are probably the most complete, and it was a writing world. It was a writing
Yes.
world.
Yes, and that's the point you and I have talked about, that you also had the idea of culture as being a mass culture. It spread through the high and the low. You didn't have the idea that only a few people have access to these treasured pearls of wisdom. You had volumes of Shakespeare in people's homes. You had the Bible. You had Pilgrim's Progress. You had the sense that culture was something that was accessible to all, not just those who'd gone to fancy schools and had degrees on the wall. Culture was something that everyone could partake of, and it would enrich everyone's life, from the farmer to the college professor.
You know, as we were talking about earlier, I find that true also in reading about, dare I say it, the city of Chicago in the 30s and 40s and 50s, when culture, what was going on in the bars and the taverns, was, you know, with the Mammoths and the Bellows and all the other writers, the guy who wrote Studs Lonigan.
James T. Farrell.
James T. Farrell. This was culture.
Yes.
And this was the average guy in the street.
And what happened to that? That's what I mean, one of the things I wanted to celebrate in this book was just that time when it was an egalitarian world, not just in terms of access to economic markets, but egalitarian in the sense of learning and culture. That everyone's life could be enriched by this. It was accessible to all. What happened to that? I'm not quite certain what happened as we entered the 20th century. For one thing, specialization was needed, of course, because we learned so much more in science that it was impossible for one person to know everything. In physics, you're not going to have another Einstein, not because we're not as smart as an Einstein, but because he was both an experimentalist and a theorist. You're not going to have that anymore, probably. But I wonder if we've also cut ourselves off a little bit, too, from this idea that everybody deserves access to culture that can enrich all lives. Public libraries are the great example of that.
You're right, and they're going the way of the dodo bird.
People act like that's not important when hours are cut at a public library. I think, what are you thinking?
Yeah, right.
It's open to all.
You know, interestingly, along that line, you make the point that the guys who got phenomenally wealthy in the 19th century, the Gates of that century, the Carnegies, or is it Carnegie, the Rockefellers,
J.P. Morgan,
they considered it their bounden duty to give back.
This is something I think is so lost. In fact, whenever these robber barons, so-called robber barons, the late 19th century, anyone writes about them or talks about them, they seem to forget, look how many universities Rockefeller founded. His idea was you make as much money as you can. You know, cutthroat businessman absolutely would do whatever he could to knock you down so he would get the profit. But his idea was you don't leave a penny on the table when you go. You give it all away. He founded the University of Chicago, a wonderful institution, Rockefeller University, Spelman College, constantly bankrolling great cultural institutions of the day. Carnegie and the public libraries, J.P. Morgan and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. These are things we wouldn't have. Cultural institutions wouldn't have. The government didn't do this. These men, and it was mainly men at this time, these men did it. They thought it was a civic responsibility. And we've lost a little of that too, I think.
Yep.
The percentage of income that a Rockefeller gave dwarfs that of our great magnates today, the Gateses and the Buffetts. And they should give as much. I mean, they should. I'm saying that the subjunctive sense, not like they should, but
they should only do it.
That's how I mean it, right. When I said they should, I'm not giving them advice, heavens.
Yeah, and I thought of Carnegie because of what's happening in libraries and his great contribution to the tune of 300 or 400 million, which is something like 8 or 10 billion today.
Oh, and their palaces. The one, in fact, Ray Bradbury, the science fiction writer, writes so eloquently and speaks with such heartfelt longing about the great public library at Waukegan, Illinois, just north of Chicago. In my hometown, Huntington, West Virginia, the great Carnegie Library with names, you know, these marble palaces, names etched around the side, you know, Schopenhauer and Goethe and Shakespeare and Milton and Pope.
Yeah.
The idea that you could be in this small town in West Virginia and have that as your example. There's a great line of Aristotle, learning adorns riches and softens poverty. That was the great idea, and that's what Carnegie. We wouldn't have that were it not for these libraries.
And by the way, none of this is to say that these people didn't also do a lot of evil in amassing their riches, because they did. But like everything else, two-sided.
Yeah, and I would say, I don't know if I'd say evil. I certainly, they did things that they could justify if they were sitting in this chair instead of me.
But I wouldn't accept it from them.
Well, I was going to say, right, or they'd be ripping off their microphone. But you know, evil's a funny word. I guess I would say that they sometimes did things which they maybe found it difficult to justify. But on the other hand, they also went to church on Sunday. I mean, there was Rockefeller every Sunday sitting there in the pew, taught Sunday school, as did his son. And I don't think they would have thought of themselves as hypocrites. In fact, they didn't. Ron Chernow's great biography of Rockefeller, Titan, makes that clear. He has a wonderful introduction when he said Rockefeller wasn't sitting there saying, oh, I'm such a hypocrite. Here I am in church, and then on Monday morning I'm going to go put some poor schmo out of business. It wasn't like that. He saw it as all of a piece. He saw life as all of a piece. You worked hard, you played hard, you gave a great deal.
It was, to a major extent, a Darwinian world with charity at one end. But the rest of it was pretty Darwinian.
Yes.
And I think it got a bad name in large part because of the Gatling gun and its descendants.
Yes.
The Maxim, the Nordenfelt, the Browning, because of the slaughter of World War I and the merchants of death. That's
what seemed to happen, yes. When you saw, Gatling, of course, had believed he had invented the gun and it would shorten war and make war less lethal, and of course the opposite happened. Never underestimate the ability of human beings to take any invention you come up with and use it to its worst possible effect. But no, I think Gatling certainly could not have anticipated what would happen. And more than any of the other guns you mentioned, I think this is why I was intrigued by Gatling and his story. The Gatling gun became a symbol, more than those others. I mean, yes, as you mentioned earlier, there were repeating rifles in the Civil War, but the Gatling gun just seemed to capture the imagination. Perhaps it was the alliteration of the name. I mean, there's something about a well-named product, Gatling gun. It just sounds like what it is.
You know, and a point that you make several times throughout the book, and I think the point is particularly true with regard to the police force version of the Gatling gun called the Bulldog. It's a sleek, beautiful instrument.
Beautifully made weapons, and then, of course, used terribly in strikes, used against immigrant populations, used for the worst possible reasons, used against Native Americans in the West. So talk about a violent juxtaposition here. You've got this beautiful, almost like a piece of art, the epitome of technology and ingenuity and American pluck and vigor being used for the darkest, most nefarious of errands.
To go back, describe the world that Gatling was born into. In North Carolina there.
Very small town, just over the Virginia border, Murfreesboro, North Carolina. It had been a substantial inland port, but far too shallow. And when steamboats came along, there was no way that it could keep pace. Gatling is born on a farm. His father was a relatively prosperous farmer, slaveholder. Gatling grows up inventing things.
Rural plantation type deal.
Yes, yes. He and his brothers are constantly inventing things and trying to make their way forward through their mind and their imagination and their hard work. He goes to St. Louis as a young man. He has come up with a seed drill.
Describe, you got a wonderful description in the book of the trip to St. Louis. This wasn't like getting in a car and taking Highway 85 or whatever, Interstate 85 or whatever it is.
I was determined. I was going to try to make that clear to people, what that was like, because the more I read about it, I thought how amazing and unthinkable it would be for us today to do this. Had he fallen off his horse 10 miles away from home, that's it. No Gatling gun, no Gatling, that's it. There was no AAA, there was no way, you weren't rescued, there was no Hampton Inn along the way. There you were. No one would ever find you. You'd never be heard from again.
Yeah.
The peril that attended any kind of a journey like this. You set off across this wilderness. I mean, there were 2 or 3 people per square mile in a lot of these places. Bruce Catton, in his histories, talks about what it was like when the young Abraham Lincoln and the young Jefferson Davis that all grew up in Kentucky and those areas. Same way, you had this vast, untrammeled wilderness. But imagine the potential as you looked out across this. And that's what I end with, too, this notion of Gatling parting the woods.
Yeah.
He sets forth on this journey. The air was so clear in those days that you could stand at one point and see for 90 miles. 90 miles. Today, you can see at most 4 or 5 miles because of pollution, obviously.
Yeah. You know, I grew up in the Midwest, and I'll interject something here. And the Midwest is, of course, the area of the Great Plains. And I was shocked to read a few years ago that in those days, they always, you always hear her talk about the prairie grass. What prairie grass? I've been all over. What? In those days, the grass was as high as a man's head.
Yeah.
And just covered the earth. So you couldn't see more than a few feet from it because there was grass, this grass everywhere.
You just couldn't, the Willa Cather has those descriptions. It was like the prairie running.
Right, like the ocean. Yeah, right.
Yeah. And it is impossible to think of now because to try to bring back this vanished world to me is one of the great challenges of this kind of historical writing. You try to muster all the details you can, all the evidence you can, and then to create this world. You can't do it ever because we can't ever really go back there. But it's this constant attempt to try to do it. And that's what I tried to do in that section, to think of young Gatling, 18 years old, setting forth on his own on horseback with really nothing going for him. He didn't know anybody. He wasn't rich or famous.
Yeah.
Off he goes. Anything could have happened.
Why did he go to St. Louis?
St. Louis was where a lot of agricultural implements were sold. There was a real thriving new community there. And he had these seed drills and these planters that he had come up with, and he thought that would be a good market for that. He went there, he got a patent on them, and he went there to try to sell his patents to manufacturers.
Would you just describe, if you would, what the seed drill was, how it operated?
It's very important because, of course, it was a precursor to his gun.
You might say it was the seed for the...
It was, exactly. It worked on a gravity-fed hopper, much as the early Gatling gun did. You would turn a crank, and it would drop the seed down, and it would down into the furrow. There was a little sharp edge at the bottom. It would dig the furrow, and as you walked along, you would push it and turn the handle, and it would drop the seed one by one into the furrow. At that time, a lot of farmers use a broadcasting method. They would just bunch of seeds and just fling it everywhere. Very inefficient.
Can I make a point? Broadcast means literally broadcast.
And we think now in terms of media, but
right.
Nowadays we'd say broadcasting versus narrowcasting.
Yeah, exactly.
And Gatling all those years ago said he tried to convince farmers to plant in rows, neat rows, and it made the harvesting so much easier. It made the sowing of the seed so much more efficient. But it was a tough sell. And Gatling he had a lot of sales techniques he would use. He'd go to a farmer and he'd say, why don't you have 2 fields, do that field over there with your method, the broadcasting, do this one here with my wheat drill. And the difference in the yield we'll use as a down payment on the seed drill I want you to buy. So he was a great salesman. He was very much.
That's creative financing.
Yes, exactly. We could use him today. Gosh darn it.
Oh, God knows.
Right.
Indeed. Also, he almost was the inventor of what has come to be called the screw propeller, which is the way every ship in the world, except for certain jet boats that run on rivers, every ship in the world is propelled today.
Yes, and he was beaten to the punch by John Ericsson, the great Swedish inventor. But Gatling had this idea. He had seen, the paddle wheel. We have it's like that against the shaft flat, and he thought, why not use the screw propeller idea, the idea of a fluted surface coming out from the shaft, which would work much better, and also could be used below the water line. So it would be, particularly in terms of military craft, it would be much better, not so vulnerable to the enemy. But he was a few months late when he went to the patent office, and he was told that. He said, nope, someone's already patented this, so too bad.
Now, just so everybody's on the same page here, John Ericsson lives in history as the man who invented the Monitor, the famous metal warship, Union metal warship.
Another great inventor at the time.
That's right. So the point I'm driving at is Gatling came as about a 19-year-old kid or something, came in second to one of the, just by a few weeks or months, to one of the greatest inventors of the age.
Absolutely. Yes. which just goes to show you, again, nowadays that wouldn't happen. I mean, I don't think a kid would get that kind of a chance. But the patent office was this great, it was a great ultimate democracy. If your idea is better than mine, then, and you're ahead.
Now, why don't you talk, because you make a point about this, and I personally had never realized how important this was and what a trailblazing break the patent office was with the previous societal systems in England and elsewhere. So why don't you talk about how the patent office came about, what it did, and what it meant for America?
The patent office to me is the real soul of American greatness. That's where it really begins. We had a patent law before we had a 13th state. One of the great genius of the founders, like Washington and Jefferson, was this idea of patents, giving inventors the legal right to profit from their inventions for a nominal fee. Unique in the history of the world. Before this, you had to have a lot of money and a lot of connections in countries like Great Britain and France and Prussia at the time. You had to have connections to get patents.
You got the patent from the crown.
Yes.
It was a special deal.
A king or a queen, right, and a fix had to be in.
Yeah.
As so many things are these days.
Nothing's changed.
but here along came Washington and Jefferson. They realized we're a new country. Yeah. We're going to need to spur our inventors on. You know, we're not going to have a lot of government money to give them to do any kind of incentive that way. We have to rely upon the incentive of the individual, and they happened upon this idea of patents. Now, Jefferson, of course, was very conflicted. He was famously conflicted about patents, wasn't really sure. Inventor himself, he was afraid they would create monopolies. So he didn't take out patents on any of his inventions. But he did become a great advocate of patents. In fact, was on the first patent board, the 3-person patent board. But no one had any idea that it would just set alight the American imagination and create the 19th century, all the great, wonderful devices that we have. A fun thing to do is the Patent Office has lists of all the things. There are great books published by the Smithsonian of all the great inventions, from the wonderful to the wacky, in the 19th century. There were treadmills that would power washing machines. That you put a dog on them, and they had a way of where the dog would run on the treadmill and operate the washing machine. There were all kinds of strange lamps, and then there were safety pins. And all of these things came about. The player piano, through the genius of American inventiveness. And the point I make is that someone like Gatling, who didn't have a lot of connections or money, would never have been able to prosper as he did, would never have been able to get more than 50 patents, except that it was a democratic system. The best man or woman won. I say woman because the first ice cream churn was invented by a woman. I'd like to say that came about through years of research in the great libraries of our age, but I actually heard that on the Discovery Channel. So you never know.
Hey, listen, maybe we should use as the AFLAC trivia question of the day.
Yes. Yes.
The question you asked the faculty, which nobody knew.
Almost no one ever gets it.
Yeah.
Occasionally there'll be a ringer in the back of the room that's read my book, and they'll holler it out, and I say, oh, don't spoil it for everybody.
And the answer is?
Well, it's the only U.S. president who ever held a patent. And you will hear people, all kinds of really interesting guesses that tell us a lot about how we regard our presidents. Nobody guesses Bush, which is not correct, but you hear a lot of different guesses. The only U.S. president ever to hold a patent was Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
Invented a device that was fitted to the bottom of steamboats that would help pull them across sandbars when they became stuck.
Right.
He invented it in the late 1840s as a railroad lawyer. He saw that this was a problem with the steamboats, and hand-carved a little device, which is still belongs to the Smithsonian. In those days, you submitted a model with your patent and got a patent.
Yeah.
And Lincoln spoke a lot. In fact, the first really major public address he gave as a young up-and-coming politician was about patents.
Yeah.
He said, all creation is a mine and every man a miner. I mean, he was a great proselytizer on behalf of patents.
Yeah. So to go back to something else, by 1900 you had movies, electric lights, telephones, phonographs, lighter than air flight, powered flight with power heavier than air flight just 3 years away. Steamships, railroads, the germ theory of et cetera, that was that was the century that really saw the changes. And one of the points, you make 2 points about that, which you've made here. I was just trying to draw it all together. One is that the Patent Office was largely responsible because it unleashed, through the profit motive, the inventive genius of thousands upon thousands of people.
Ordinary people who otherwise would never have been heard from, I think.
And the other point is that was in its own way tied in with the movement for self-improvement, every man a cultural king, so to speak.
Yes, and again, that's another idea that I think we've kind of lost, and I don't say this as like kind of being an old fuddy-duddy saying, oh, the past times were better. I say that because I think we can revive that spirit. I think we're on the cusp of another kind of a time like that in American life by necessity. We have to be. We're into some perilous times.
Tell me why you say that, other than we have to be.
Well, we have to be, and I think necessity is always the mother of invention. And we're at a time right now when we need some new ways of thinking about things. We need to replace the internal combustion engine. We know we have the technology to do it. The impediments are not only the imagination, but also how do you get that kind of thing to market? How do you make the people who have enriched themselves by existing technologies, how do you make them want to change? So it's not just a technical challenge and not just an imaginative challenge. It's also an economic and a political and a psychological challenge. How can I make you want to do what you do differently when you've done very well the old way? So you've got all those challenges, and no one likes and appreciates a challenge more than an American. I mean, I'm an unabashed, I guess you would call it an American exceptionalist. I do think we're unique in the history of the world.
Well, perhaps in those respects. The patent system, what I hear you describing is very similar to the argument that goes on about the patent system. You mentioned, I believe, that Jefferson was very dubious about patents, and you said at lunch later admitted he had been wrong. But you also have a long footnote in the book. I think it's about a 2-page footnote. You quote Gary Reback and others.
Yes.
Who say, well, maybe the patent system these days, because people take out all kinds of patents and they patent every little slate. They block progress.
Right, on purpose. They want to kind of keep any interlopers out.
That's very similar to what you're talking about.
And that's something else we have to do. We have to figure out a way in an internet age, patent and copyright as well. What can we do about that? What can we do to keep information free and widely disseminated, but yet also ensure that inventors and writers profit? I mean, the music business is the one that's really been hurting by that too. You want composers and musicians to be able to profit from what they produce, and if everything's out there for free, they're not going to be able to do that. So it's a terrible challenge.
It's a topic for another day, but as recently as last night, I was talking to somebody who was pointing out that the settlement between the authors and the publishers and Google may go a long way towards creating the kind of situation we need. I mean, put it in simplest terms, it's a sort of an ASCAP or what's that other one, whatever it is, where, you know, if you play a song on the radio, you pay these guys a certain amount of money, and then it goes to the composers and the band and this and that. So maybe that'll be the way, but everybody agrees we've got to find something.
We have to find, yes, and the challenges that we face today, while they look so incredibly daunting, as you and I both said, I mean, look at what they had in the 19th century to face. So we've done it before, we can do it again, and I do believe it'll come from just this American spirit of entrepreneurship. That's a crucially important factor. It's not going to come from a government-funded program. It's going to come from the individual sort of beavering away every night in the garage or the basement or the spare room with a dream and a hope and a prayer, hard work, a little bit of luck, and it'll happen.
A lot of people don't like to accept that theory. They think it's a very 19th century theory, and they're often hard-pressed to come up with lists of great inventions invented by bureaucracy.
Yes, exactly. And I'm a little bit of a kind of a naive, starry-eyed idealist, I think, as a result of writing this book and thinking of what we're really capable of. It was amazing the problems that were faced in the 19th century. And again, without a central bank, without any kind of sort of foundation, I mean, when you failed, and a lot of times you died. And your family suffered and died. So it wasn't any kind of, there's a kind of a quaintness that adheres to times past. We look at all these old photographs and it looks like sort of a cute time with a lot of ice cream socials and all that. And of course the reality, it was a hard, brutal world where the penalty for failure was pretty terrible.
And you know, another penalty people paid, and this is not a penalty for failure, but it's indicative of the times. Anybody who didn't lose 2 or 3 or 4 children before the kids turned 5 was awfully lucky, because medicine was so primitive and disease so widespread.
I talk about that in the book as well. As you know, because Gatling had some medical training, and in those days we knew so little. I mean, circulation of the blood? What? You know, people would have looked at you like you were nuts. The things we didn't know then that we know now, and yet people lived, even amidst with all those impediments, amid all of that, they still somehow kept at it and kept struggling. And that's why I think Gatling is a wonderful example of that, the American who overcomes tremendous obstacles to achieve a goal that in itself has some ambiguity about its ultimate good or evil in terms of the world.
You know, speaking of ultimate ambiguity, I'm going to ask you a question, but I'll tell you a little story which you may know. You know, what's his name? Alfred Santos Dumont, the guy who invented for the powered lighter-than-air ship. He used to take off in his dirigible and fly. He lived in Paris. He was Brazilian, and fly to one of the famous French restaurants. And like a guy ties up a horse at the rail, he would tie up his Zeppelin and go to have lunch, come out. You know, this was like 1899, 1900. You know, it's a scream. The story's an absolute. The Brazilians think we're crazy for believing that the Wrights invented flight. Santos Dumont invented.
Well, as you say, everybody's always, you know, there might be an earlier one to all these people.
All right. In any event, when he invented explain how the Gatling gun itself incorporated elements that Gatling had previously used in other inventions, and why he set about to invent this gun.
That's so important. You're saying why he did it, because yes, the profit motive is important. Yes, the profit motive is a good and noble thing, but Gatling also thought that he was inventing it for the best of all possible reasons. He sold his gun only to the North in the Civil War, because he had been a slaveholder himself, as had his father, but he turned his back on that and repudiated slavery. He believed that if you invent a gun that requires fewer people to operate it, fewer soldiers will then have to go into battle. One of its nicknames was an army in a box. It simply was more efficient. Fewer soldiers in battle meant fewer deaths. He also believed that if you invented a machine that was so terrible, so awful, so cataclysmically bad, the other side would give up and go home. And this was the same reckoning that we used, of course, toward the end of World War II, when the scientists creating the atomic bomb said, we'll make a device so terrible we'll be able to truncate the war itself and save many millions of lives. This was Gatling's idea as well.
And you know, the nuclear weapons may have done that to the extent that they foreclosed World War III. But they did not foreclose, I guess, literally hundreds of horridly lethal wars.
Well, and of course, yes. And since then, I mean, the best laid plans and the best of intentions sometimes go awry. And I know there's some controversy now about the development of the atomic bomb and what we knew and what it was really used for, and was it really to defeat the Japanese or to show the Russians that we weren't to be pushed around in Eastern Europe. So.
Well, I've read those debates, and personally, I'm sympathetic with Harry Truman, with all the people who lived, because these weapons were used. And I personally don't agree with those who think,
and the second guessing too. He had to make the decision. That's the thing. I mean, you know, regardless of what I think about the decision of a leader, a person in charge, it comes right down to it. Somebody had to make that decision.
But what I want to drive at is this. That was the same thinking that motivated Gatling.
Yes.
Because Gatling, you point out in the book, he lived in Indianapolis at the time. He'd go down to the train depot. They called them depots in those days. And he'd see the bodies and the broken and the dead bodies coming back. And I said, oh my God.
He said, why this? How do we make war less? As you know, many more soldiers died in the Civil War from disease than died from bullets. So he said, what a terrible waste. And he says, how do we make war less lethal? How do we require fewer soldiers to fight it? And the answer is a device that is more efficient.
What he didn't foresee is that they would have more soldiers, but they'd have more machine guns.
Well, yes, I think technology he knew, psychology he didn't know so well.
I guess. And then, when we were discussing Maxim before, Maxim was an American inventor of peaceful products who wasn't doing very well. And a friend said to him, you want to make a lot of money? Figure out a better way for the Europeans to kill each other. And he went out and he invented the Maxim gun, which was the English machine gun of World War I.
And a definite advance on the Gatling. Yes, no doubt about it. But without Gatling, there probably wouldn't have been a Maxim.
Probably wouldn't have been a Maxim. Now, why is it? Well, two questions. The first one is this. Why were Gatlings hardly adopted at all, is the accurate way to put it, hardly adopted at all during the Civil War, even though they were ready for production by 1864?
They were, and they tested very well. When they would do testing at the ordnance grounds of Gatlings, they tested very well. All the reports were great. The chief of ordnance was simply opposed to new machinery. They were adopted after the Civil War, when they'd gotten rid of the old guy and a new guard came into the ordnance departments, and they realized going forward, we do need new technology. The world is changing. We want to be a part of that. We want to be in the forefront. And so Gatling guns were adopted, and many were bought by congressional edict.
Right.
So it was recognized as a great gun. It was used in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, as I point out. It became the icon of America, the symbol of our kind of can-do, get it done, don't mess with me, braggadocio.
Amazing. The only time it was used in the Civil War was, I won't get into who Ben Butler was, but he used it near Petersburg once or twice. And the New York Times put a couple of them on its roof when the draft riots in 1863 after Gettysburg threatened.
I always love to point that out, that yes, the New York Times editors got on the roof. The draft riots were going on in New York City. The people were going toward the Times because their editor, Henry Jarvis, had editorialized in favor of the draft and in favor of Lincoln's beginning of conscription. And so here comes a mob, and they look up on the top of the New York Times building, and there are the editors of the New York Times wielding Gatling guns, trained at the mob. And so everybody goes home. And it's very funny because, of course, my colleagues and I joke that a newspaper editor, put nothing past them. They'll do anything, including Gatling guns, to get rid of us.
Why was it permissible after the Civil War to do, as you've mentioned, to use Gatling guns against Indians, for the British to use them against Africans?
Yes.
And for them to be used by others against Africans. There's a great line in a Kipling poem about we're better soldiers than Fuzzy because we have Maxims and Fuzzy hasn't.
That's right. That's right.
Which is what they, is a term of opprobrium, like gooks. But why was it permissible to use these weapons against these kinds of people, but not other Europeans?
Such a crucial point. That the Gatling gun, in addition to being this icon of Americana, also became, we mentioned that soldiers like the idea of the gallantry in battle and the vigor and pluck and dash. Opposed to that was technology. So the idea was, if I was going to fight you and you're my equal, we're both white Europeans, it's going to be one-on-one, you versus me. But when it came to these populations that didn't look like us, I mean, the racism implicit in Great Britain's imperialist adventures in Africa and elsewhere, this is where you saw the Gatling gun used. American soldiers would use them in the West in trying to clear out the Native Americans there, because the idea was, well, I wouldn't use a Gatling gun because it would tend to dehumanize the opponent against somebody I respected, but I can use it against these people that don't look quite like us. So yes, the fact that it became this enforcer of racist impulses is really quite awful, and I think quite tragic, and really antithetical to what Gatling certainly would have wanted them to be used for. He would not have approved of this, and didn't.
Don't you have that line in there from that, or the stanza from that great poem, and the line goes, the Gatling's jammed and the colonel's dead.
Yes.
The river of death has brimmed its branks. And
right, play up, and play the game.
Play up.
That was that great. Sir Henry Newbolt has this great poem about that. Yes, it was that vigor, that pluck, the sort of British schoolboy idea. That you go forth into the world, and it's just like on the the idea of World War I being fought on the playing fields of Eden.
One of the most poignant lines in that poem is, England's fire and honor's a name.
Yes.
Just a word. When the enemy's there shooting at you, honor's a name. That's all it is. Now, at least that's the way I interpret it. Maybe others interpret it differently. England's fire and honor's a name. The Gatling gun also had a lot to do with Theodore Roosevelt. Well, number one, Custer could have taken 4 of them, right?
Could have had them, yeah. I think it's somewhere between 2 and 4, yes. Was offered to them at the Little Bighorn. He didn't take them, and people use that as an example of his kind of arrogance, like, I don't need those guns against these Indians. What do I need it for? But actually, he probably had a good point. Against the rugged terrain, given the carriage of the day, it probably wouldn't have been very feasible to use a Gatling gun. But yes, Teddy Roosevelt was a great fan of Gatling guns.
That wasn't a good point in light of what happened.
Well, no. But I mean, it would have made it even worse, maybe. Even worse, not better. Wouldn't have saved him. But Teddy Roosevelt, yes, was a great fan of Gatling guns. Used them in the Spanish-American War. Always said he would never go into battle without one. I point out that he was our first president to ride in a car or fly in an airplane. But his real love affair with any kind of entity was with a Gatling gun.
Why did the Germans, I mean, you point out that the French, who called it Elan, E-L-A-N,
yes,
and the English and the Russians, at the beginning of World War I, didn't have that many machine guns because this was infra dig. It was still mano a mano.
Yes.
The Germans had 5,000 of them.
The Germans figured it out.
Slaughtered the. Why did the Germans have such a different idea?
You know, it's funny. It's hard to generalize about nationalities, except to say, I mean, but history kind of lets us do that without it seeming like we're casting aspersions on nationalities. The Germans realized that machines. They had some forward-looking people in their military that realized machines, precision-made machines, were going to turn the tide of any sort of war. That was the coming thing. They had this way of seeing over the next hill, much more so than the British and French, who, as you say, were still caught up in this idea of elan. I mean, the Barbara Tuchman book, Guns of August, it's made abundantly clear in there that there still was this idea that was brave, noble, you know, flourishing your saber and you'd fancy outfits and all this. And here were the Germans saying, "Oh, really?" And then out would come the machine gun and just mowing down. The great line where terrible line, or when the German machine gunner says they went down in their hundreds, they fell in their heaps, the sickle shape of the fallen. And yet they kept coming. They kept coming. They didn't want to believe that the old ways of battle and warfare were over. It was over. The day had gone. The sun had set on that. We're in a new world where technology ruled.
Before that, and before Gatling, but for some period after Gatling, what were the social role of guns was much different from what it is today. Describe what it was then.
Yeah, it was, and of course we were a different kind of a country then. We were there weren't any arguments about the Second Amendment and all that. That would not have even occurred to anybody. Lincoln loved guns. Lincoln fired a gun every day of his presidency. Off he would go every day, every day. There's a wonderful book published in the 50s. That's one that should be reissued. It's called Lincoln and the Tools of War, about Lincoln's attitude to armaments, not only what they would procure, the Ordnance Department, but also Lincoln's attitude toward guns. He was a gun nut. He's what today we would call a gun nut. He loved firing guns. He enjoyed doing it.
President of the NRA today.
I'm sorry?
You'd be president of the NRA
He might very well be. He leaves the presidency. They need something else to do. But he loved them. He found them technically interesting. He was very much a man of the 19th century. And the idea of guns was not a controversial one in those days. Now, you could argue that we've changed so much. We have problems in our inner city because of guns. So the world has changed sufficiently so that you can't make a one-on-one comparison. But there was a sense of armaments as being an economic product, as being something that we needed to fight wars. We needed a strong national defense. We realized that at the beginning of World War I when we weren't prepared. World War II, the same thing happened. And we now have learned that the best way to keep peace, of course, is to prepare for war, a line made famous by a man you and I both read much about.
In those
Grant.
days, as you describe it, guns were just another consumer product.
Yes.
Like washing machines became, and they had those in the 19th century, or cars became, or plates, you name it.
Eli Whitney made guns. J.P. Morgan dealt in guns. Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect, dealt in guns. Guns were, a product. They didn't have this kind of sinister repute that they have
today.
It was
World War I and the Merchants of Death, which really changed that all around, didn't it?
Yes, I think so. There was much more of an idea of being guns, something you would have in a household, something a father would pass on to a son or to a daughter.
Yes, one reads about people who had 150-year-old flintlocks in their houses.
Yes.
Christopher Spencer, who invented the Spencer repeating rifle, which ultimately became, yes, he got merged too. The Henry rifle became the Winchester, but Spencer was part of the same company. He went to, it's the damnedest thing. If there's one way to get yourself thrown in jail today, it's try to get into the White House with a rifle. That was a pass in those days. Hey, I have a rifle. I want to show the president.
It's so funny. Yes, Stoddard, Lincoln's assistant, would say he'd have guns piled up all over his office because he'd say, "You want to get to see the president? Bring a firearm." Nowadays,
and he'd go out to where I guess roughly the Lincoln Monument stands. It was incomplete in those days, but that rough area. He'd go out and he shot Christopher Spencer's repeating rifle and
loved it.
And loved it, indeed, and tried to get Ripley to adopt it. And those things would have shortened the war because the South did not have the technology and could not get the technology through the blockade.
And even if they weren't as efficient as we would think of them now, also it's just a symbolic power. You show up with a repeating weapon, a weapon that no one has seen before, and talk about shock and awe. I mean, that's what you would see, original shock and awe.
In fact, there was this old Confederate thing about the federal forces have a gun that they load on Sunday and shoot all week, which I think is a
Exactly.
reference to the Henry rifle, which had a tubular magazine with 18 brass cartridges or copper cartridges in it. The Gatling gun was declared outmoded by 1911, and yet it still exists today in dramatically more effective form, doesn't it?
It is still around. In fact, I was just reading a Dale Brown thriller. Do you know Dale Brown? He's a retired Air Force officer who writes thrillers about Navy technology. Very up to date, very up to the minute, a bestseller. Page 3 of his latest bestseller, there, Gatling gun. Gatling guns are still used. When General Electric wanted to invent the minigun just before the Vietnam War, they used Gatling's original 1864 patents. They used 100-year-old patents of Gatling's. That's how technologically ahead of his time he was.
Is that because in the Vulcans and the Vietnam, is that because you have less of a heating problem if you have a whole lot of barrels?
It's, you know, it's a lot. A lot of people have, that basically revolving barrel technology is one, and there are several other technical reasons and design reasons. Gatling also constantly refined it. He didn't just invent it and walk away. In fact, in studies of Custer, Evan S. Cannell in his book says the Gatling gun had been invented and then never improved, and that's a base libel. That absolutely is not true. Gatling constantly improved it. He took out dozens of patents on refinements to the Gatling gun throughout the 19th century.
I mean, ultimately, he had an electric trigger or something like that.
Yes, electric trigger, and then he invented the Bulldog you mentioned, a smaller Gatling gun. He encased the barrels in a jacket.
Now, at the Crystal Palace exhibition in England in 1851, Samuel Colt showed his revolvers. Now, this was a famous World's Fair. We hear about the New York World's Fair of 1933 and the Columbian Exposition of 1893, you know, blah, blah, blah. The New York Fair in 1964, where AT&T showed the video conferencing stuff, which didn't come to anything for 40 years or 30 years. Colt showed his revolvers, which illustrated interchangeable parts, which were called the American system. Explain what that's all, because that's the font of the Industrial Revolution.
Absolutely. He could dump all the pieces in a box, jumble it up, and then put the revolver back together again. People had never seen anything like that before. It did. It revolutionized all kinds of manufacture, not just armaments, but so many different things. But he was also there in 1851 was Gatling, not with a gun, but with his plows. He was also at the Crystal Palace exhibition.
And that was actually, you know, people say that weapons, rifles in particular, were the driving force of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. A fellow named John Hall at Harper's Ferry creating the first interchangeable parts rifle. And it got taken, that plus the assembly line, which actually had its origin in the United States in the disassembly line of Swift and Armour and the rest of those people in Chicago.
I make that point too. Even earlier than that, in Cincinnati, they did. Cincinnati was called Porkopolis because they could take a pig, and the old Chicago line, they used every part but the squeal. Same thing there in Cincinnati, but decades earlier. No, you're quite right. I mean, if this book does anything, or our conversations like this, is to remind people that armaments are not these instruments of evil that sometimes they're purported to be in our sort of contemporary mythologizing about guns. Guns can do terrible things, but guns had a very crucial role to play, not only in our national defense, but in the 19th century, in our emergence as an industrial power. That there are good things to say about guns. We don't often hear that. We don't hear that side of the story told very often.
Just tell, in 15 seconds or less, explain why Gatling, who once was as widely known as Bill Gates, I suppose,
absolutely,
is no longer thought about as a human being, and what that said about and why America partially lost its love affair with guns. This is
just my theory. Is that the reason he isn't a household name, which he should be the equal of an Edison, and the reason or a Bell, and the reason he's not, I maintain, is because of our continuing ambivalence about our military might. Everyone's heard of the Gatling gun, but Gatling himself is kind of lost to history because we don't like the idea that to be a great world power, often that has to come at the point of a gun. And that's an ambivalence we should celebrate. I mean, it's a good thing that we're uncomfortable with our great strength in wielding it. We wield it only as a last resort. That's all to our great credit, but it also means that Mr. Gatling, unfortunately, is forgotten.
I think for the first time in my lifetime, and more so than by far than after Vietnam, we're beginning to re-examine this question of how we became a great power and what it means today.
I hope so. I hope so. And I think Gatling somewhere is smiling and pulling a trigger, probably.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Give my love to everybody I know in Chicago, which is down to about 2 people these days. To the audience, thank you for being with us. Be with us again.